to host today's discussion regarding the student loan crisis, what you are not hearing. So much of the news and reports are now focused on student loan forgiveness and which students should have their loans forgiven and how much. We think that this might leapfrog over more fundamental questions of why we are in this mess in the first place. And so we hope that today's webinar will explore some of those issues. I'm very happy to have our three participants today, starting with Neetu Arnold, the senior researcher at the National Association of Scholars and author of the recent report, Priced Out: What College is Costing America. And also Professor Bryan Caplan, economist and professor at George Mason University, and author of several books, including The Case Against Higher Education, presumably for most people. Also having Naomi Schaefer Riley, resident fellow and scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and the Independent Women's Forum. We'll proceed in that order with Neetu first, and then Bryan, and then Naomi, and I did get their permission to call them by their first names. Thank you for that. Today's program is being recorded, and we welcome, after the roughly 10 minutes of presentation by each participant, questions from those viewing live. My preference is for the chat button as opposed to the Q&A feature, because the chat appears on the side rather than blocking my screen. So if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and I will get to them as best I can. Before we begin with the formal program, I did want to reference a few figures and numbers so that we're all basically on the same page of why this constitutes the crisis that it is called. Last August, the Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing on this very topic to accompany the introduction of the Fresh Start Through Bankruptcy Act, introduced by Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois and Senator John Cornyn of Texas. I would recommend for those interested to view that hearing, as there is a lot of good information and would bring people up to speed on the current issues. I found Senator Grassley of Ohio's remarks especially informative to provide a landscape. So I'm going to repeat a few of those figures now and then add two elements that I think also are relevant. Nearly 44 million Americans carry some level of student loan debt. The average level of debt is now almost $30,000. That is the average, which is to say many graduates, especially of professional degrees, carry much more. That figure is double what the figure was 10 years ago. And indeed, the average tuition for a four-year state university degree has also doubled in that time frame, and that figure has more than tripled since 1978. That means that the rate of inflation for higher education tuition exceeds not only the general rate of inflation in the economy, but the rate of inflation even for medical care, which has long been deemed unsustainable by most in the policy community. The default rate on these student loans is said to average about 15%, with 11% defaulting within the first 12 months after graduation. Last, I would add that this type of debt is singled out in the bankruptcy code and in bankruptcy proceedings as different from consumer debt and not dischargeable, at least in practice, in bankruptcy proceedings, unlike consumer debt. And we can perhaps explore why that should or should not be the case during our discussion. The last thing I would like to say is that most people overlook that the schools got most of the money, but the graduates got all of the debt. With that, I'd like to turn to Neetu for her remarks about her report. So Neetu, you now have the floor. You are muted, Neetu.
What a great way to start. Well, thank you for serving as our moderator, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think a lot of the solutions that are proposed when it comes to the student debt crisis immediately jump to extreme solutions such as free college or massive student loan forgiveness. And a lot of times they're not addressing the underlying problems. And I also find that much of the discussion around the solutions, sometimes they want to maintain the status quo, such as continuing public funds to universities. And so I think before jumping to those extreme solutions, because I think we should only jump to those kind of solutions when we've made good faith efforts into making college more affordable and trying to understand why it's become so expensive. I think we need to ask some vital questions, such as what is causing the rising college tuition costs? And is it necessary for everybody to attend college? Would our world fall apart if everybody was not going to college? And so I hope to address some of the explanations behind why college became so expensive and answer the question, what drives a lot of students to attend college and what should be done about this? So typically there are around 5 explanations. People debate about why college costs have become so expensive. So the first one is state disinvestment, and I refer to it as cheap states theory, which essentially argues that universities needed to increase their prices to make up for any losses in state funding. The second theory is Baumol's cost disease, which says that rising costs can be attributed to increases in professor salaries to prevent those professors from moving to other fields which pay higher salaries. The third theory is Bowen's revenue theory. Essentially, it says that universities will always find a way to spend any money that they receive. So essentially, when revenues increase, expenditures will also increase. The fourth explanation is college earnings premium, which it says that the college degree is simply that valuable, and that's why it's become more expensive. And usually the supporters of the earnings premium theory will cite the differences in pay between high school and college graduates. And then the final explanation is the Bennett hypothesis, which is named after former Education Secretary William Bennett, who believed that federal aid, the presence of the federal aid system, gave universities the incentives to increase their costs. So I actually go through in detail these theories in Priced Out, and people can access it on the NAS website. I'll also try to link it here at some point in the webinar. But, and our viewers can go there if they want to know more information. But for the sake of our discussion today, I will focus on cheap state, Bennett, and the earnings premium. So the cheap states theory is often supported by those in the higher education establishment, especially those who are administrators, and they have a good incentive to do so. Oftentimes, many of these people would benefit from more state funding. They have more money to work with, but also many of the college presidents, for example, one of their primary roles is to fundraise for the university. Now, I do think we need to question the premise of cheap states. And that is something I did do in Priced Out, where I looked into this for 26 public universities. Many of these are large state universities. And what I found was that between 1980 and 2018, state funding to the average public university decreased by around $3,600 per student, but the tuition revenue increased by around $14,000 per student. So clearly there's something more that's going on besides losses in state funding, because it was more than made up with the tuition revenue. I'd like to make just a tiny note here. Out of the 26 colleges that we tested, 2 of the colleges were actually affected by any changes in state appropriations, and those 2 colleges were California State University in Los Angeles and Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. I think those may be special cases because both of those schools are in states where there are multiple university systems. For example, in California, there's a UC system and Cal State, and so maybe something that's going on is just that there's a lot more competition, and so any changes in state appropriations, some of the schools may be more sensitive than others. But going back to cheap states theory, essentially based on my analysis of our 26 public universities, it's not all that it's cut out to be. Now that leads me to the Bennett hypothesis, which has implications that are contrary to what supporters of cheap state may want. And that's because Bennett would essentially, it's cutting back on funding. And I think that's why the Bennett hypothesis receives a lot of hostility from the higher education establishment. I actually had somebody tell me who was going to grad school for education. They told me that it was debunked, the conversation is just done. And I'm not really sure what research they were referring to, because oftentimes the people who are against Bennett, they will cite research that's either older or they rely on poor models. And if you look at some of the newer studies, they actually support Bennett. And I can cite off a couple of the studies here. So in a 2017 Federal Reserve study, they found that a college's undiscounted price increased by 58 cents for every dollar increase in government subsidized loans. We also see in this study that the undiscounted price increased by 37 cents for every dollar increase in Pell Grants. Another study done in 2019 found that colleges increased their price between 20 to 60 cents for every dollar they received in federal loans. So that's sort of what's happening with Bennett hypothesis, that it's controversial, but there's been more support over the years. And then finally, the one I wanted to get to is college earnings premium, which I think it answers the question, why are people willing to pay for higher education even though it becomes more expensive over time? And so I think that's what the college earnings premium actually explains pretty well. And this is usually seen in the advice given to students by their parents, by educators. In general, our culture has this view that everybody should go to college because they will be so much better off than if they graduated from high school, or if they just have a high school degree. And in Priced Out, I actually talked to parents and students from across the country, and I got to hear their stories as to why they decided to go to college or they didn't go to college. And there was one person who explained to me that she had worked at a bank in high school, and her employers loved her. They loved that she did a great job. And so immediately after she was offered a job, and that employer would have paid for her community college. But when her teacher heard about it, she was told that she was making a big mistake. Luckily, this person did not listen to that advice, and she decided to do what she thought was best. And she didn't graduate with any student loan debt, and she seems pretty happy with her choice. But there are many, many people where they do consider those factors of just the difference in salaries, and that's how they choose to attend college. At least that's one of the reasons. And so to summarize the implications of each of these theories, the 3 theories that I just explained, cheap states doesn't really substantially explain the rise in college tuition. And so the implication is that if we are supporting cheap states, that means we would support more state aid to lower costs. But if we don't support cheap states, then the solution isn't to increase state funding. Now, I think college earnings premium and Bennett hypothesis provide much more powerful explanations as to why tuition has been rising. And so our policy prescriptions are going to be based more off of those two theories. So the implications of the earnings premium is that if students earn a lot more and are wealthier over time, which there is robust information about that, then we really shouldn't be concerned if if these students face temporary indebtedness. It would also be unfair to ask those who didn't attend college to subsidize a process that produces significant financial benefits for other people. Now, I think there's a little bit more to what I'm saying here, a little bit more to that story, and it's that you could justify more public subsidies to higher education if going to college added a lot of more skilled workers to the economy. But I think we're seeing that a lot of college is about signaling. I know Bryan talks quite a bit about that. And there are a couple of signs we can see of the signaling. First is our high underemployment rate. It's right now at 40% for recent college graduates, and many remain underemployed 10 years later. We also see that a college degree doesn't necessarily mean a value added. And we can see that with the number of, we have an overproduction in psychology majors. And just because you have more psychology majors doesn't mean they've added more to our economy. And so this kind of leads us to the implications of Bennett, which is saying that our education system, our society would be a lot more better off if we actually took away the subsidies. And so it would be cheaper and more efficient long term. It would also encourage fewer students to attend college. And for those who do attend, they'd probably benefit the most from it. And the implication for those who don't end up attending college is that they don't have to be stuck in this credentialist society. We can actually have more options so that people can become successful without going into a ton of debt and spending time studying something where they may not find any value in it. And so what I noticed with these two theories of earnings premium and Bennett is that they address rising tuition from the demand side. In other words, if we want to fix the problems with student debt, then we need to reduce the demand for higher education. And so my view on the solutions for student debt need to address the demand for higher education. We shouldn't be having so many students attending college. We also don't need that many colleges. And I think in order to fix the system, it's become quite dysfunctional. I do think we need large-scale changes, and I hope that we can discuss what those solutions will be. Like, I have a couple of ideas, such as ending the federal student aid system. That's kind of the dream. I don't think a lot of people are a fan of that, though. So, another solution could be just reserving federal loans for those who are entering high demand fields, fields that we need a lot more workers in this country, and those that have a high return on investment. So I will turn it back to you, Teresa, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Neetu. And that reminds me, I did want each participant to think about, if you were in charge, what it is that you would recommend the policy discussion be in an ideal world. And then maybe also, given the realities of today's discussion, what you would contribute, especially for policy proposals. That is a great ending to segue to Bryan. So Bryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I agreed with a lot of what Neetu is saying. I'm going to structure my talk in the following way. I'm going to talk about what I think the normal view is about student loans and what the problem is. Neetu was very good on that. There was a few hints of the normal view, and my mission is just to eradicate the normal view and replace it with what I think is the correct view. So let's just start. What is the normal view? What is the student loan crisis supposed to be? I think the normal view is the problem is that there's a whole bunch of innocent students who, through no fault of their own, have piles of debt, It's a horrible burden on them, and we got to figure out some way to help them. Furthermore, it's when we talk about the possibility of student loans, we need the student loans in order to keep college affordable, and we need to keep it affordable to ensure that lots of people go to college. I think this is the overall view that most people have. So I just want to start off by challenging the view that the student loans are actually a big burden. Just to think about what's happened since COVID. At the beginning of COVID, a number of emergency measures were put in place. First emergency measure said that you don't have to pay you don't have to make any payments on your student loans, regardless of your income or employment or situation, and that continues now. So over 2 years after COVID, still, you don't have to pay. Now, what did this do to behavior? Well, about 99% of people who owed student debt completely stopped paying. Furthermore, the interest rate was cut from its already low subsidized level to 0%. Remember, this is in a period of very high inflation. So essentially what's going on over the past few years is that anyone who had student debt didn't have to make any payments. They accumulated no interest, and instead inflation rapidly eroded the size of the debt. So the idea that this is some horrible burden on them, to me, is very strange. Now, even before COVID, what we can say is that these student loans are at heavily subsidized rates. They are some of them are offered at very subsidized rates, others at rates that are called unsubsidized, but are actually also still heavily subsidized because you could not get any private lender without a government guarantee to offer unsecured, uncollateralized debt at these rates. So again, even before COVID, these student loans were actually a great deal for the student, not the horrible burden that people paint them as. The real story is that people get a great deal subsidized by the government, and then they complain and say, oh, wow, this is so bad that I have to go and repay, despite the fact the terms were exceedingly generous and subsidized by taxpayers in the first place. All right. Now, another part of the normal view is the idea that it's very important to have these programs because otherwise it would be too expensive to go to school, and then we wouldn't have enough people going to college. All right. Now, what can we say about this? Well, there is a lot of evidence that reducing the cost of college increases both attendance and completion. If you assume that we should be making this number as high as possible, then it's hard to be against anything that's increasing the amount of attendance. This is how we're building our human capital. If you look in the details, what you can see more clearly is that what really increases college attendance is just cheap tuition or grants. The next thing, though, that increases attendance is subsidized student loans. If you literally offer loans at a fully market rate, that doesn't seem to do much for attendance because guess what? The market rates are so unappealing, hardly anyone wants those loans, so not going to actually induce much attendance. But the idea that the reason why college is this expensive is because of the loan programs, there really is a deep puzzle there because the reason why any kind of subsidy works is by reducing the net cost. So yeah, it can very well be true that Bennett is right and that when you go and offer a lot more loans that some of this leads to higher tuition. But the reason why it changes behavior at all is that when you look at the new price minus the subsidy, you're still getting a better deal, which is what students are getting. All right, so this is just to correct what the normal view is. Now, what do I think is the right view? The right view goes to a lot of what Neetu was saying towards the end, which is that it is just wrong to think that we want to maximize the number of people going to school. Why? Well, when you look at what students actually study, only a very small share of it, even plausibly, is building human capital or teaching job skills. Rather, most of what people study in college is stuff they will never use after the final exam. Why then does the labor market reward it so heavily? Because of that magic word that I wrote a book about, and thank you, Neetu, for knowing the word, because it's the word I want everyone in education to be talking about. Yeah, signaling. Signaling. A lot of the reason why education pays is because it's a way of showing off. It's a way of signaling, of convincing employers, of getting a stamp on your forehead. When I talk about this to Spanish-speaking audience, I say it's because of the estampas on your forehead. You know, necesitamos muchas estampas. All right. All right. What does this mean? It means that you can be just as qualified as your parents or grandparents were for a job, but to actually get that job requires more education than it used to in the past. There's a special name for this. We call this credential inflation. when researchers have used BLS data on exactly what you really need to know to do a job and compared it to what you need to have to get the job, good estimate is that we've had about 3 years of credential inflation since 1945. This, I say, is the real cost of everything that we do to subsidize education, everything that we do to subsidize education, not just student loans, grants, anything we're doing to keep tuition at below the actual cost of the product, is encouraging this credential inflation, encouraging people to go and get degrees, not that actually teach them useful skills, but that allow themselves to say, hey, look, I've got a master's. Those other people only have bachelor's degrees. So I am actually statistically a better bet. You should hire me. Some of this is just government credentialism where the civil service will have rules saying you must have a certain degree. But most of this actually we see in the private sector. Employers are not wrong to think that in the current environment, people with more and more prestigious and just more degrees are on average better. The problem is that we could be getting just as good of a ranking of workers if everyone had fewer years. And then we would go and hire someone who had the bachelor's degree over the high school degree instead of the PhD over the bachelor's. I mean, think about this. In 1945, only about 25% of the American workforce had finished high school, which meant that many high school dropouts managed divisions of companies. Some ran important companies. Like, how could they? I mean, these days you would think it would be crazy to go and put a high school dropout in charge of a major division of General Motors. It wasn't crazy in 1945 because the degree said something different in those days. In 1945, it said this person is absolutely fantastic. This person is amazing if they have the PhD. Now it's not that great. And so, well, it's not just a PhD. We need to have 2 PhDs. We need to have a PhD from Harvard. It's got to be the better degree, that kind of thing. All right. Closely related, by the way, is the fact that most STEM majors don't even work in STEM. What's going on? Yeah, you go and you get your degree in physics and then you get hired in finance. You don't need to know any physics to work in finance, but people in finance want someone who is smart and disciplined enough to do well in physics. And then they bring you over and they say, yeah, I think if you can learn general relativity, you can learn how to trade options. So let's go and hire you for that. All right. So I say that the first step to understanding the student loan crisis, so-called, is to realize the real problem is not that college is unaffordable. The honest problem is that it's too affordable. Way too many people are going. Government has heavily subsidized it to the point where people feel like they have to go in order to not shoot themselves in the foot for the entire course of their career. This is why parents are terrified if a kid says, I'm going to do some alternative thing. Maybe my kid will be stigmatized for life. This is really what we should be focusing on. On top of all this, saying like, who are the real victims? So people want to act like the people getting student loans are victims. They knew the deal when they signed on, and the rates are heavily subsidized. And who subsidizes them? Oh yeah, the forgotten people, the taxpayers. So I say really we should be focusing on taxpayers, who are the real people suffering from this. Again, you could say that the students suffer in the very broadest sense that they'd be better off in a less credential inflation economy, but definitely the people to focus on directly are taxpayers who have to go and pay for all this stuff. And the very most sympathetic, of course, are people that don't go to college at all, and then are saddled with high taxes to go and pay for the people who do want to go. In terms of what we should really be doing, the low bar, I'll say, is just to restore the stupid status quo ante of 2019. Like, no forgiveness. You borrowed the money, you have to pay the debt, the interest starts accumulating again. And if you don't like it, then you endure whatever the mild sanctions were as of 2019. To me, this seems like the bare minimum that you should be pushing for, is just to say, look, the crisis is over. You got a fantastic deal. Indeed, really, you got a ridiculously good deal, such that you didn't have to pay anything for years, even if you remained gainfully employed, even if you got a large raise, even as inflation eroded the value of the debt. You know, the effrontery of someone like that to go and complain, oh, I'm going to have to start paying the stuff again. Yeah, well, should it be you that borrowed it, or all the taxpayers that already subsidized it? Now they got to pick up further for this tab, despite the fact that you got this giant debt holiday. Now that's ridiculous. So bare minimum, I'll say, is simply just restore the status quo ante and say, look, the emergency's over. We're going back to the normal world. What do you think? You get to be to have the stuff be free forever. Nobody else gets that. Why should you? Right now, in terms of better things, of course, there's just getting rid of the government subsidized student loan programs. I'll say for me, that is not a priority. I'd say much rather go and get rid of the grants, get rid of the full subsidy, not this part. Thing is that if the government really fully subsidized it, then there's almost no reason not to go. As long as the student loan, at minimum, that introduces some sense of personal responsibility. It's like, you mean I'm going to have to pay this money back if I borrow it? Oh no, maybe I should at least consider whether this is a good idea for me to go, and thereby not contribute so much to the credential inflation. So yeah, so I would say great, kill the program. Although if it's a matter of killing programs in order, I would start by killing the grants, start by killing the things that actually make it free or it's just free money. Say by comparison, student loans are one of the least abusive programs because at least they give people some incentive to think before they go and attend. Now, I also really liked the idea that Neetu was talking about on how about we limit the loans to people that are entering into occupations where there's demand. Where again, I think the simplest thing is just to say the loans are only for people in STEM. Everybody else, pay your own way. If you don't like it, don't go. Right? At minimum, we're going to focus on the jobs where we have at least reasonable evidence that people are learning useful job skills. I think that's overrated, but I still think that STEM, if people are learning any useful job skills in school, it is in STEM and not over in the other more dubious programs of which we are aware. And yeah, notice I'm not trying to carve out an exception for economics where I am. Sure, out of all the non-STEM, econ should be first, but I am willing to throw myself on the sword nobly and say, sure, throw my group into the group that does not get the student loans either. All right, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Bryan. I do have to mention, I mentioned before the program that my older son is a comedian. He was formerly an electrical engineer. All right, Naomi, we can finish off with you. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Teresa. So I kind of want to pick up where Bryan left off a little bit. I was actually reading an obituary in the New York Times the other day of this longtime writer named Frances Clynes. And I came across, just in case people think that when we're talking about people foregoing college degrees in the past and still being qualified for their jobs, the obituary mentioned that Mr. Clynes started his 59-year career for the Times. He started as a copy boy without a college degree or formal journalism training. So it used to be you could even rise the level of editors at the New York Times without the college degree. It's not just that we're saying you could be a plumber without a college degree, which I think is useful for people to know to kind of dismiss this argument. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit from the perspective of the demand side, but maybe the individual demand side and how individual families are making issue that is quickly becoming more personal for me. When I started writing about higher education, I was unmarried and have no children. And now I have 2 kids in high school. So I better come to a conclusion about this fairly quickly. So the one thing that I think we haven't discussed enough in terms of the loan situation is how much of the debt is being incurred by people who actually don't finish their degrees. And, you know, unlike some products you can buy where a little bit of it is useful, a college degree is basically does not have much market value unless you finish it. And the level of prestige that's associated with an associate's degree is just so much lower than that associated with a bachelor's degree that it is really rarely worth it. So as families and as, you know, incoming students, asking the question about whether you're really going to finish the degree and how quickly you're going to finish the degree, I think is an important place to start. Because if you're the kind of person, and your parents may know this about you, who starts things and then doesn't necessarily finish them, taking on debt to enroll in college is going to be a pretty unmitigated disaster, I think. The second thing, and this is just, I say this because, you know, it's kind of the middle of the summer is often when I hear people talk about how they're visiting colleges. And I think this is the most inane time to visit colleges. If you're caring about like the beauty of the campus, maybe, but I think that your visits to college and questions about where you should attend should at least focus in part on what's going on in the classroom. And I don't think enough people do this. So I want to just emphasize kind of there are some different choices that are students have here. What kind of requirements, first of all, the college has. So let's say you're a student who doesn't know that you want to go into STEM, or you don't know whether you want to go into STEM. I think that there is some usefulness in going to a school that is going to require you to take a certain number of general education distribution requirements for your first year or so, just so that you get a sense of what the options are out there, the order in which you're supposed to take those things, and really be kind of well equipped to make a decision going forward about what's happening next. The way colleges kind of market themselves, which I've always found a little ridiculous and unfair, particularly to students who are not coming from a background where they already know what they're doing or their parents know what they're doing, is colleges present you with a, it used to be an actual printed out college catalog, and now it's just online, but, a doorstop size, here are all the exciting options you have. And for most 18-year-olds, what happens is that their freshman year looks like a combination of, 18th century women's literature, zoology, a little bit of business administration, and it's a completely incoherent mix, leaving them kind of not really with a taste of everything, but just kind of wondering where to go from here. And I think colleges that have thought out their general education requirements and, looking at an organization like the American Council for Trustees and Alumni would give you a good sense of whether a college actually has a coherent understanding of what it's trying to provide, is, I think, a good place to start. Then the question is, as you are deciding what to specialize in, there should be a sense of what is this going to do for me when I leave? And obviously, this is the National Association of Scholars. We're not, it's not all about, how can we only translate our liberal arts education into the highest amount of financial compensation. That should certainly be, I think, a factor. But the question is, what else should be a factor too? One thing I think that is often overlooked is the speed at which you get through college. So, and not that you should necessarily apply all of your high school grad credits to get through college faster, but schools like Purdue, which have decided that they are going to offer programs that allow kids to get through it faster, using summers. I mean, colleges are completely, they're a complete waste when it comes to the use of an occupancy of buildings over the summer, except for maybe kids' summer camps. But colleges that have really thought through that, whether you can take courses over the summer in order to finish your degree faster, I think, are signaling that they have a lot more respect for your time. And one, topic that I think, Bryan definitely talks a lot about in his book, but we didn't get to here, is the opportunity cost of college. So even when you are deciding that college is basically free, or that you won't have to pay back these loans at a very high interest rate, there is an opportunity cost. And I think more and more students in the last couple of years have really seen that. People are worried about, lowering number of kids enrollment of kids at college. And a lot of them are saying, look, there are all these, high paying jobs out there. Maybe I should be doing that instead. So definitely as a family, kind of factoring in what the opportunity cost is both in determining whether you decide to go to college, but also trying to figure out how quickly you can finish your degree. I want to sort of just say something about the size of classes too. I mean, everyone, talks about the sort of kind of the unsaid value of college, that it's people that you meet along the way and networking opportunities and things like that. I think that when you're thinking about college and when you're at college, like trying to make the most of these is very important. I think for most people, it's harder to do that at a very large school. There is definitely an argument for finding those smaller honors colleges or smaller environments within a larger university so that you can actually spend time with professors and, get that kind of networking opportunity that people are talking about. It's definitely a benefit that I think liberal arts colleges have for all their expense, that there is sort of kind of a more personal aspect to it. And if you want the help of the adults on campus, it's more available to you. Although I will say that many students do not take advantage of going to see professors for their office hours, and professors are often just twiddling their thumbs during these times. So even if you do decide on a large university, there's definitely an opportunity there for you to go make friends with your professors, and highly recommend that in terms of a good use of your time. One thing to think about if you are, like, I think looking at the STEM question, I mean, so as Bryan said, a lot of these schools are just selling their signaling device, and your diploma from your Ivy League school or other prestigious institution says one thing, and your diploma from a public institution that may be easier to get into says another thing. It's interesting, though, in the STEM fields that the salaries tend to even out more quickly. The Wall Street Journal did a really interesting study, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, about the salaries of people who got engineering degrees 10 years out of school. And they found almost no difference between kids who went to the most elite schools and kids who went to schools a couple of tiers down, which suggests to you just how much of this signaling is going on, that kids who actually learn engineering, that's what an engineering firm actually values, and not necessarily the name, even if that will get you a little bit more money up front. And I think, that's generally true. This is a conversation that we have sometimes in the context of admissions preferences decisions. Kids who end up going to schools where they may be in over their head often end up transferring to easier majors, and as a result lose a lot of their earning potential, as opposed if they started at a school which matched their capabilities, they might be earning a lot more 10 years out. Just a couple of other things I might add. Sorry, this is a little all over the place. So in terms of like what I versus what I would in terms of realistic policy today, I would say one fantasy I have is the idea that actually, let me go back because I have two more very quick points. So the first is that one of the opportunities that college does provide people with is not only the chance to sort of do networking professionally, but also the chance to network personally. So I wouldn't underestimate. I know there is a joke about people going to college to get their MRS degrees from 50 years ago, but as you will never find like another kind of pool of people, or as much time as you have on your hands as you do in college, who will be kind of conducive to finding your mate in life. And so I know nobody's a fan of getting married early these days, but I do highly recommend college for that opportunity. The second thing that I just want to mention before I get to my dream plans is that, I am a fan of colleges that are trying to use data in order to figure out which students are most at risk of dropping out or of failing classes. Colleges, especially large universities, have a lot of information about what colleges are doing. And if I were the parent or advising someone who was kind of on the margins of whether they should go to college or not, who was worried about whether they could complete it or not, I would appreciate a little kind of babysitting or nanny statism, that colleges would be regularly checking up on students, how they were doing in particular classes, asking or even mandating that they go see professors or TAs if they're struggling. It's a signal that a college really does care about whether you graduate and whether or not you're actually going to make good on those loans ultimately, and whether you're going to have used your time wisely. So I would think about that as well. In terms of the fantasy I have, I mean, I would really like to see more colleges offer a kind of stripped down version of college. I mean, a lot of what is inflating college costs these days are both student life and administrative costs. I think that there really is a market out there for students who want to get an education. Some of it may be, kind of directly applicable to their jobs, and some of it may be less so. But especially, in the kind of where the economy is headed right now, if a college was willing to offer, a shorter degree, including summers and, ideas, with a view to getting a job afterwards, but also, these are the basic classes that we expect you to take, and every student who graduates will have basic proficiency in these things. I do think that there could be a market out there for that. In terms of what should be done in terms of policy right now, I don't have a lot of disagreement with Bryan or with Neetu on this. It seems like we need to go back, and the less government is involved in subsidizing higher education, the closer we'll be able to get to kind of a true picture of what we need higher education for, what individuals need higher education for, and be able to sort of put a lot of our resources and energy in other ways as well.
Thank you so much, Naomi, Bryan, and Neetu. I want to remind viewers to post questions or comment in the chat if you would like to participate, but failing that, I do have questions of my own. And as most people know, I usually don't mind directing things. So I would like to throw out a couple of issues. I'm very interested in this idea of signaling and credentialism. I almost think we could reduce this to status and image. In fact, a lot of surveys show that college graduates lose not only knowledge, basic knowledge in areas such as history and civics, but lose skills, for example, in writing and actually also in reading comprehension. This is I think should be jaw-dropping. I do also want to mention that my grandfather, I come from a long line of attorneys. My mother's father did not graduate from high school and began clerking at a law firm in a nearby city and became a lawyer just by clerking and then taking the New York State bar. My other grandfather took the Pennsylvania bar 1 year out of high school after going to law school for 1 year when it was an LLB, which is to say, the current, one question is there any occupation that couldn't be done via an apprenticeship? Any occupation, doctor, engineer, lawyer. We are quite wedded to this idea of a bachelor's as a prerequisite for medicine, for law, and engineering, but one has to wonder about that. And I've often said that people are actually smart before they go to college. That's how they get into college. And if this is a signaling game, could I got into Harvard appear on the resume as opposed to the BA from Harvard? So let me just stop there and see if anyone has comments on that. Yes, Bryan.
I have a whole section on this in the case against education. This is really one of the best arguments against my story because it says, well, look, if it really were such a high share of signaling, then you wouldn't need to go to Harvard in order to get that big pay bump. You would just go and take your acceptance letter and over to Goldman Sachs and say, hey, hire me. Like Harvard likes me. In order to really answer that, you have to think about, well, what exactly is it that you're signaling with your college graduation? And look, one of the things is that you're smart, but it's true. That's something that's pretty easy to establish. You don't need to go and spend all those years. So I say what you also need is to say, look, I'm not just signaling intelligence, I'm signaling work ethic. Even that, though, you might say, well, why don't you just go and work for free for a while? I say, really what the key ingredient to make the story, for the story to make sense is you have to show that you're signaling conformity. In our society, the thing that a normal human being does, if they have this kind of talent, is they go and they endure 4 years of education. And if you refuse to do that, that is almost like going and getting a face tattoo. It's almost like going and getting the spider web on your face and saying, hey, well, I got great SAT scores, I got into Harvard, so hire me. Like, we're scared to hire the guy with the face tattoo. It is so abnormal in our
becoming more acceptable.
Yeah, right. And so like we're scared. Now, obviously, this is where cultural relativism does play as a real role. If we were in medieval Japan, then it'd be weird to not wear a kimono at the interview. So there is some flexibility about what counts as weird and what doesn't. And yet, well, in our society, the bachelor's degree is a standard thing. And if you try to weasel out of it, you really do risk burning up all the goodwill that you get from everything else about yourself. And think about this. You know someone that has fantastic SAT scores, but they flunked out of college. Probably you don't question their intelligence. You say, oh, all right, that's one of those really smart people that's super lazy or just totally defiant. And then it's like, oh, so I want to hire that guy. No, I don't want to hire the super smart but lazy and or extremely defiant person. I knew a few people like that actually. On the one hand, yeah, like they're like I've known some geniuses who are just the worst employees because they are so oppositional and just won't do what they're told. And there's no I in team. A job is a place where people work together. That person isn't going to work very well as an employee. So I think that like what we like intellectually, this is a great challenge. I think there is a good answer to it. In my book, I actually describe it as locked-in syndrome, meaning that the status quo, given all the subsidies that it has, as well as given social norms, it is very hard to break out of it. I have been betting people against the downfall of the status quo for over 10 years. I finally have started winning those bets because they were long bets that took over 10 years. It took 10 years plus to mature. Yeah, so about 10, 12, 13 years ago, I started betting people that online education would not make the status quo go down in flames. Because I said, yes, look, online education, it's probably just as good or better for teaching knowledge, but it doesn't give the right signal. If you show up at a job interview and say, yeah, I didn't go to college, but I watched a lot of YouTube videos, so I'm highly knowledgeable, that is not going to get you the job. Probably it's not even going to get you the interview. Rather, if you put that on your application just goes in the trash. You never even get a chance to explain what's going on. So that's what I say is the problem. Now, what is the remedy? There I say that we have to remember there's an enormous amount of government subsidy on the table, which really does tip the status quo. If fewer people could afford to go, this would also mean that the stigma would go down in the same way the stigma was very light in 1945 because there's so many qualified people without the degrees. If you change it to a system where a lot of people can't afford to go, you also change it to a system where employers can't afford to just say, oh, well, if you didn't go to college, then I won't even look at your application. When it's just 5 out of 100 of the people that don't have degrees are actually good, then yeah, throw them all and don't interview any of them. But if you get up to half of the good people don't have degrees, this is where you really need an open mind.
Yes.
I want to add just quickly, in reference to your older relatives, Teresa, that the other problem, and I think this is correct, that people point to is how much less kids are learning in high school now. So I would not say that most of the high school graduates that I know would be able to take the bar exam, let alone make head or tail of a lot of the questions that are on it. And, obviously it's troubling to sort of try to figure out which is cause and which is effect here. But that being said, I do think that kids need a lot more education to be able to get into certain professions. I mean, certain professions, absolutely, apprenticeship, and there's no reason why you need a 4-year liberal arts degree. But to the extent that some of that college education is standing in for kids, actually learning how to read and write a little bit better, I understand what you're saying about that. It's possible that's getting worse. But I do think that kids are typically presented with more challenging work in college than they are in a lot of high schools in America. The second thing I just say in relation to your question about why don't I just present my acceptance letter at Harvard is that it's, a lot of employers would, I think, actually be happy to see that. We have outlawed, we legally prohibit employers from giving IQ tests. And so, they can't just require you to show your SAT scores and choose by that. But I think that in many cases that would probably be quite effective. I mean, absent the conformity signaling that Bryan is talking about, a lot of employers would be very contented if they were able to see that you had super high SAT scores and might considering hiring you based on that.
Yes, a lot of this is, I think, conformity and the norms, but the question is, do the norms serve the well-being of society, and especially the well-being of our young people? And with respect to the lazy genius, I have to say that those getting admitted to what are called the elite schools, there's not a lazy bone in their body, and that is very evident from their high school record. So it's not for that curious, brilliant guy who just won't get off the couch. These are high skill, high energy before they go to college, before they get their degree. And yes, Naomi, this is an important topic, the chicken versus the egg. One might argue that the education system, so-called, is infantilizing young people. We only have to think a few generations ago. I think it's Barbara Bush, who was married at the age of 19. That generation, Bryan keeps bringing up 1945, that generation at the age of 20, 21, they were adults. Many were married, many had children in dependence. And I think of that, Naomi, when you say there should be a little bit more, I think it was hand-holding or for young people or babysitting. It is quite shocking that in the last 50, 60 years, the redefinition or the postponement of adulthood. So now we feel compelled to hold hands for college students, whereas, in 1945, that same demographic had been off fighting World War II. All right, I have a second issue, probably for Bryan, but for anyone. Bryan, the issue about, you need to pay that back, ignores the many bankruptcy discharges, readjustments, and settlements that all sorts of other people enjoy, but college graduates have been singled out and been denied. It also ignores the economic realities that are much different today, that employment is not stable the way it was. I'm from Rochester, New York, which was the headquarters of Kodak, and everybody I knew when I was growing up was at Kodak for 50 years almost and got their gold watch. Those days are over. Employment is a big question mark. We've already discussed underemployment. A lot of young people don't have the benefit of someone like you to advise them. They only know that people like the President of the United States is telling them they should go to college to get a good job, and then they come face to face with the reality of our economy, which is that salaries have not kept pace with tuition levels. No one told them that before they got their degree. And meanwhile, banks can get bailed out because they are too big to fail. So it looks like everybody can get a discharge or a forgiven debt except graduates. So that's a different way of seeing. One other thing, as I understand it, we have a problem with compound interest and all of these pauses and deferments. And as I understand it, the terms and conditions are not that favorable anymore. There's in favor of income sharing or a percentage of your income going into repayment. So those favorable terms and conditions that you mentioned, I don't know that they're the norm anymore. So if you could address that.
Yes, the non-dischargeability of student loan debt in bankruptcy, that's true. It is a reason not to get the loans. It is one drawback weighed against a long list of extreme advantages. And there's a reason why the amount of student debt people have borrowed is so high. It is a fantastic deal with this one problem. Yes, you cannot get rid of it in bankruptcy. Given that there's no collateral, that is a fairly mild incentive for people to actually go and pay it. You were mentioning at the very beginning what the high default rates. Yeah, it's not so surprising people default when there's no collateral and you're just taking them on their word. I would say this is just a very mild nudge in the direction of trying to get people to actually pay back the loans so that it isn't fully on taxpayers. As far as I know, actually, the student loan payment moratorium is still ongoing. I could have missed principal resumption. I think it's been extended until August at least, probably be extended another 1 or 2 times. So yeah, so this is basically as favorable as it possibly gets, where yes, you have a loan, but you haven't had to make any payments for several years. We cut the interest to 0% during that time. And also there's tons of inflation to go and erode the debt. Yes, you can say, well, they're kids, so you can't expect them to go and look into things. Like honestly, like any system where you say that there's a period when you're not an adult and then you say you are an adult, there are going to be some people who are not psychologically much more mature than they were the day before. But what are you going to do? You say, look, you're an adult. You got to start acting like one. This is what we tell kids in general. Like, you're 18 now. Yeah, I mean, like, you may not feel different from yesterday, but now we're going to start treating you like an adult. You've got adult privileges. You can go and have sex with people when you want to. On the other hand, also, there could be, like, you might go and borrow some debt and someone will actually expect you to pay it back. Yeah, there's pluses and minuses of being an adult.
Well, Bryan, with all due respect, that strikes me as a bit of a dodge. Let me be more specific. A middle-aged person can discharge their consumer debt, including for overseas travel and whatever struck their fancy to put on that credit card, with no 10-year waiting period, which is now being proposed by Congress. That middle-aged person can discharge that consumer debt, whereas a young person cannot discharge student loan debt. That's the question. Why is this type of debt singled out for harsh treatment toward our young people who've not been given the guidance that you would as a wise dad?
Right. And I'd say the answer is that the credit card debt, that the fact that you can declare bankruptcy is reflected in the interest rate. You pay a much higher interest rate as a result. I do think it would be great if you could make deals with other lenders saying, I cannot declare bankruptcy in exchange for lower interest rate. The law doesn't allow that. But again, you have to look at the package. It is student loan debt is an incredibly favorable package, which is why no one without the government subsidy would probably be offering it. The reason why it even exists despite this is because we have one somewhat onerous term, and then we have a pile of other advantages. Do you want that? Okay. It really is like saying, hey, there's a house, it's really great, it's cheap, but somebody died in it. Do you still want it? Yeah, I guess I still want it. Yeah, so again, there's a lot. Look, it's so easy to feel really sorry for people with student loan debts. We should be feeling sorry for the taxpayers who are getting ripped off. The people getting student loans got a great deal.
All right, anyone else want to contribute on that point? Yes.
Oh, Teresa.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm not muted. Okay, I'll add something. I would like to see, at least for private student loans, I think people should be able to discharge those kind of loans in bankruptcy for very serious cases. I do think it matters how we define financial hardship here, because simply saying, well, I don't like to pay my loans back, that's a little different from actually struggling. And I would agree that private loans, I think, should be able to be discharged. And maybe it would also give lenders, specifically banks, careful consideration who they give loans to. I think that matters. I think something else I'd like to see, at least for federal loans, while we still have it, is I'd like to see some more efforts put in. Like we should have some sort of test before students can even qualify for getting those loans. And if they don't pass the test, then they can't get the loans. They should know what an interest is. I've been surprised by the number of people who don't know what an interest rate is. And if you don't know what an interest rate is, if you don't know what you're getting into, I don't think it's a good idea to have the taxpayers give that money. So I think there should be some safeguards in place. I'm not necessarily disagreeing or agreeing with Bryan here. I'm just kind of adding on, but related to this topic, I think those are some changes I would want to see. And I know those are more smaller changes, but if our system is going to be in place, then I think we should at least make sure that students are well aware of what they're getting into. I also think parents should be quite involved with this process, because just because a student is 18, yes, they're an adult, but for many of these students, they've never had a job. They don't really know what they're getting into. And I think a parent still has a responsibility, like a personal responsibility, to make sure that their child is still making some better choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I would say that it's important to remember that a lot of these students are adult students. I mean, they're not just 18-year-olds with responsible parents who are advising them one way or the other. The other thing I might say is that one important waste of money that the student loan money is going toward is for students to essentially be taking remedial classes in college because they didn't learn what they were supposed to in high school. And that, I mean, if you compare the cost of giving a kid, that same class in high school versus college, or that same class, like in a, even in a community college setting, it's significantly less. So, some way of sort of, saying this is money that could be spent on actual college level classes might be some useful restriction. I haven't thought through all the policy implications of that, but it is a huge waste of taxpayer money to pay for a K-12 public education and then subsidize remedial classes at the higher education level.
Yes. Excellent point. There's an overlap here, of course, between the rigor at the secondary level and the rigor at the post-secondary level. This is building on layers, and this is also grade inflation or credentialism. People in the 1940s with a high school diploma arguably were better read and possibly better informed than PhDs today. This is a question of the content. I did want to address Naomi's point about the MRS degree, which I do appreciate to some extent. I don't know if Neetu's report found this. People are paying for the company, not just for their professors, but for the caliber of their peer group and if they're similarly inclined. But I also want to bring up something that is rarely broached. There was an interesting article a few years ago about how college and universities are descendants of cathedral schools, which is to say the university was modeled off of the Middle Ages University of Bologna, I think, in the Sorbonne at Paris. And the interesting implication of that is that university was originally designed sort of as seminaries, that is for people training for the religious life who had to have a higher degree of knowledge, since Latin was the language of the church and Greek the language of the Gospels. But one could also say it was intended for a very tiny segment of the population, since most are not called to the religious life. And now, however, we are promoting higher education for virtually everyone. Does anyone have any comment on that? And the other thing is that it's being promoted as a ticket to economic well-being, as Bryan has said, get into the middle class. So are there any thoughts on that, sort of the original purpose of the university and now what it has become or being marketed as?
Teresa, well, earlier you mentioned in your question about the MRS degree, and I'm a product of that. I wasn't trying to get my MRS degree, but I got it. And I do think college serves as a filter for the kind of students that you get. It depends on what the university is looking for. I think Harvard is it's elite, but I think they care more about entrepreneurship and business and being a leader. And some of the other schools, they may have high expectations in terms of SAT and ACT scores if they still measure that, but they're not necessarily looking for future leaders. And one thing I did find in my report is that students were more thinking of the social values of college. Some of it, meeting people who are like-minded, but some of it was also just which ones had the best parties, which ones had the best social life, which one had the best sports teams. And so I think that's also a part of it. I didn't see so much people going to college to meet their spouse, but that doesn't mean it's not happening, of course. But I think to address your other question, which is just how has college changed from its religious beginnings here in America to what it is now, I think we've definitely moved away from that. And it's interesting because I feel like the university today tries to uphold two competing missions. One, and it's not so religious, it's more about just bestowing knowledge to people without the expectation of getting a job. And then they're also trying to appeal to students who are simply going to college so that they can get a job. And so I think these two missions clash, where you have one which is just more, it's a, you know, private benefit, whereas the other one is more of what can I do to get a job. And so I think colleges try to cater to both, and that makes them inefficient. It dilutes the education, because if you're going to college to simply get a job, well, now you have to take courses where maybe you didn't want to take it. Maybe it doesn't apply to what you really want to do. And if you're one of those students where you want a broad education, you want to learn as much as possible about many different subjects, well, now you're stuck in classes with people who are just not taking that seriously. And so I do see that there's, I acknowledge that a lot of what college used to be was about religious education, and that's clearly changed over time. And now it's become a massive jobs program, but they're also trying to say, well, we want people to have, we want to bestow knowledge upon them.
Yes, that also points to a socioeconomic reality. The young people going for a job probably need employment, and that explains their focus, whereas those who are going for a broad-based humanities education, this does strike a lot of people as a luxury. Just to spend 2 to 4 years reading literature, learning language. I also wanted to mention that there are alternatives. Of course, with COVID, we've had an increase in the number of students who take gap years or decide to forego college. So there are other things where people can learn, joining the Peace Corps or doing missionary work. Interestingly, and some of the comments have brought up the different systems abroad. For example, in the United Kingdom, being able to go to medical school right out of high school. Actually, I knew a German carpenter who, as part of his formation, had to travel the world selling his wares, which is to say he had to work for people with his carpenter skills, and he stayed with people. That is, he stayed with us and he fixed our roof. We had him for a week. And he went to all countries in the world, working as a carpenter, but traveling and meeting and dealing with different languages. I bring that up as a way of thinking outside the box about what constitutes education. And this is also one question that a viewer has asked. I want someone who doesn't want to go to college at 18 to eventually get college level education in history, literature, psychology. I would add perhaps some civics, as well as world history. Do you have any comments on that? The person who is inclined toward higher education but doesn't see the numbers adding up in their favor to spend 4 years at a post-secondary institution. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there are a lot of alternatives. I mean, I think there's definitely a benefit, at some colleges that are, offering a very coherent education, but, the number of classes that you can get, through great courses or YouTube. I mean, this is where, there's a lot to be said for online education. I'm not sure that it's going to do the same job as a typical undergraduate degree, but if you're someone who's motivated and already interested in a wide variety of things and is not trying to use that degree in order to, pass certain tests or gain skills to go to the next level in some profession, I think that there's so much available out there now that I would sooner advise someone to take, a great courses, something than to go back to school. That being said, I definitely hear from lots of professors that they love having older students back in the classroom because, of course, they know why they're there and they've experienced a lot in the world and they're much more focused because they realize, what an opportunity they have. So, there's something to be said for that. But in terms of advising the individual student, it's hard to say this is the best use of your time or money.
Yes. Bryan.
Oh, yeah. I would add, it's very important to distinguish between inputs and outputs. The fact that someone attends a class in history or literature or psychology or civics does not mean that they actually learn anything, and especially does not mean that they retain anything later in life. We have very good data on this, which confirms strongly the pretty much gloomiest possible view that college students who are made to go and take these classes still know next to nothing about them later on. And so saying that you want people to sit in the class, I'd say really doesn't make much sense because hardly anyone knows this stuff. Like I can understand someone saying, I want people to actually have the knowledge. College does not seem to be a good way of giving people the knowledge. Vast majority of people can go through the class, they do the minimum they need to get the grade, and then they're done, and then they forget it, or they just learn it at a very superficial level. It's disappointing, especially as an educator. You're always hoping that you will change students for life. What we know from the data is that hardly ever happens.
Yeah, interesting. Although those intent on learning, those few certainly will, and perhaps they will regardless of format, regardless of in-person or online.
Yeah, like you can always take comfort in, I changed one life, but it's a question, does it make sense for taxpayers to go and fund everyone to do something when one person out of 100 comes away understanding Shakespeare?
Yes.
Like Shakespeare's great, but that costs, to go and waste the time of 99 people so one person can understand Titus Andronicus.
Yes.
Crazy.
I'm interested, Naomi, in your comment about the associate's degree, in part because disabusing people of the prestige, image, virtue signaling of going to college, I think disabusing people is going to be a really difficult task. I mean, there's just this idea, you're a success if you go to college, but so lots of people are inclined, this is again the discussion over norms. And as Bryan says, who's going to have the courage to deviate from the norm or not conform? What would it take? I mean, does Harvard even offer an associate's degree? Because if the elite prestige schools were to offer, 4 years is a long time of foregone income and, to party or to spend time not retaining what's said in the classroom. Do you think that's a possible avenue to explore, to encourage these schools to offer a shorter period so people can get the experience, meet other high caliber peers? That is a big part, I think, of
I don't think the prestigious schools have any incentive to do that. I mean, they can take your money for longer. If anything, they want you to get a 6-year degree. I mean, forget about the 4-year degree. I would say the one hopeful kind of line along this is the number of schools that, are allowing kids to, to spend their first 2 years at a junior college or community college and then transfer in, and get a kind of tuition break and be able to transfer their credits over. And that's really an acknowledgement by sometimes the flagship state schools that the education you're going to get at, a much smaller junior college is actually the equivalent in many cases to the first 2 years you would get at a large prestigious state school. So that seems to be a little bit of kind of saying we know that's the case, but the private, large prestigious universities they have no incentive to do that at all.
Right. That's good that you bring that up. Okay, so I see Bryan needs to wrap up. We've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes. So I want to thank all of my participants, Bryan, Naomi, and Neetu. I think it was a really fun discussion, and hopefully we can all meet up again. And thank you to all the viewers and your comments, which are largely links I see, but Chance, our technical support, will see what he does with that. So thank you again for your time. A lot of fun, and I hope we can all stay in touch. Okay.